So sorry about that stream. I'm very very bad with that, not checking my settings before I start the recording. All right, guys, you didn't miss much live on stream. That was literally just me doing the intro and the hello. So let's get into it now. I was just saying we're going to talk about the raids before we get to the blood DK. So, mate, you literally just came out of a raid. I have to tell you, I know nothing about Cataclysm raids. I was talking to a mate last night going, it's actually funny how little I know about Cataclysm in general. I'm just going in blind and not really looking anything up and having a great time. But, mate, talk us through. Let's go about the race to world first, if you're okay with talking about that. I mean, Progress once again stamping their authority on the rating scene. Is it really much of a surprise that these guys just keep dominating?
Not really. They've been the top of the leaderboards for the entire time I've played WoW, and I've always been conscious of them. And you watch the modern retail scene, and you've also got your big names out there that household names. You got your methods and you got your progresses, and it's just an assumption they're going to take the bar each time. But in the community that I'm part of, our little guesses were, are they going to do it again? Is someone going to come in with this side strat that people aren't aware of? Because in Cataclysm, there's been an awful lot of things that haven't behaved as we thought they would do from private servers, and a lot of things that have had, a couple of little niche tricks in. And to spoil the day, really, Progress just came in, absolutely nailed it out, and just took the, stole the show, really.
Hmm. Mate, did you guys? I mean, I'm obviously presuming you guys jumped in straight away. Were you in your own little blast to world first, or are you guys kind of just happy doing your own thing?
We so I'm in Scotty J's raid team in
Uh-huh.
NA on Mancrick. We weren't pushing for a race, but our intent was to go as hard as we could on the first night because we're trying to make up for the two missing days with the release of this lockout. We just finished a 7-hour raid session tonight, so we were in there on launch, and we got I think we got 5 down on launch night. And then we had, a good session today where we got an extra 2 kills today. So we're making our own way. I think we're service second in the 10-man heroic scene, which is what we're pushing at the moment. But we're part of a wider guild, a sense of purpose on Mancrick, and there's multiple raid teams going, but we're pushing the 10-man heroic at the moment.
Okay, so were you guys happy with the performance that you pulled off on day one? I'm presuming there was a lot of private server practice and all that stuff for you.
Um, we had more practice on the beta. Half the team are private server veterans, but quite a few of us, myself included, hadn't raided Cataclysm fights since original Cataclysm. So it was a bit of a learning curve on the beta, but the bosses we did kill on the beta, we've now all killed since, and we just got our first new one down tonight after about 20 pulls on Conclave.
Hmm.
So we're a bit of a mixed bag, but we do have a really solid set of hounds, a solid set of raid leading hands in Majay. He just knows the fights in and out, and he's just giving us the strats, and we're just trying to execute on them. That's really it.
Oh, he definitely sounds like he knows his stuff. So, sorry, I didn't catch it. Have you done a full clear or not?
We haven't full cleared everything.
Right.
We're now 5 of 6 in Blackwind
Right, right.
Descent. We're 1 of 2 in Throne, and we're 2 bosses into Bastion Twilight. So we haven't full cleared the tier yet, but we're server second in the 10-man at the moment. So
Okay.
we're competitive in the server region, basically.
Now, you must have been keeping an eye on things on what others were doing. Have there been any shenanigans so far, or was it all pretty standard practice in what Progress or what others did in getting everything down?
From what I've seen and watching back, I believe it was all fairly standard. They just came in with cleaner execution and had less wipes, basically, on where they got the kills.
Fair enough. Mate, I mean, as you say, a lot of this is kind of a shock for a lot of people that maybe haven't done this since original Cataclysm, with, the Cataclysm private server scene not being as big of a thing. What was the more surprising thing for you in doing this race today and yesterday, or coming back to Cata raids? Was there a boss that, or an encounter that you were like, fuck, that was harder than I remember? What was the annoying part?
Oh, Annoying part. From a tank perspective, there's quite a few different answers I could give you, but from a raid encounter, I think my entire team would tell you that Maloriak is a snooze fest, and that fight particular has an awful lot of mechanics that you just do them and then you wait for the next one. And doing damage to the boss doesn't really make much difference because he has a big heal and you don't want to put him at a certain percentage until a certain point. So it's a waiting game.
Right.
That's probably the least enjoyed one of the tier at the moment. But from tanking, we've just done 40 plus pulls on Alakir tonight, and I can tell you that's my least favorite boss so far.
Oh, is it full brick wall status? What part are you guys tripping up on?
We just started towards the end of the session getting to reliably into the last 10%. But we had a few people who had to leave and we just had to cycle in players. So we then had to re-progress and we just couldn't quite get back to the same point.
Right. Was it one of those classic nights where, like, obviously people have to go to bed, but if you had 2 or 3 more hours, you probably would have gotten it down?
Um, Probably not because it was at the end of a 7 hour session. But tomorrow we're going back in there fresh eyes and we're hoping to probably get that down tomorrow.
Right. Very good. Now, I obviously appreciate that you play tank, so you come from that perspective. But of the encounters that we have in this phase at our disposal, what's we talked about the most annoying one? What's your favorite?
I think Omnitron Defense System is probably the most fun you can have as a tank because it pushes both your communication, your coordination, and your ability to master your class and your teamwork with your healers and the rest of your raid. It's just the full culmination of if you wanted to describe a fight to someone who didn't play World of Warcraft to show the skills that you actually are involved in a community, in a team. I think that's the fight of this tier that just really stands out because if you can get that fight down on heroic difficulty early on in the phase, I think it just shows you've got a really solid group of players together because you all have to communicate well, you all have to execute well, and one slight mistake and it's just an instant wipe.
Hmm. Mate, I have to apologize. I've got a million little questions that are just popping into my mind that I'm sort of
Sure.
keen to get your take on. But like, this is all coming from someone you have to understand who's not touched. You know, number one, I'm not a big raider in general, but also number two, I've not touched raiding in Cata. So this is all absolutely. I literally haven't seen these fights. Like, I don't fucking know what the deal is. But to ask a more generalized question, I'd say, you know, coming from a more high octane guild's perspective like you, and, you know, particularly as the main tank of a high octane guild, not to make you throw people under the bus, and I'm not trying to sort of, you know, name call or anything like that, and I'm not trying to start a movement where we start ostracizing certain classes or specs, but have you already noticed straight away in this first 24 hours that there is a class or a spec that is somewhat dragging its heels through this early content of Cata?
I've been fairly fortunate, and I don't think I can give you a fully honest answer on that one, Josh. But I will say we have fights where the comp that we've been using has been fairly rigid. So I've only just been accustomed to the very high caliber of player that is in the team. But also the comp was handpicked and selected. You know, Majay put this all together, and we've just basically built what we thought was the strongest chance to get the fights down. Having watched a couple of streams and a couple of colleagues in my guild who've done the 25-man normal players that we've had this week, I did see that there's a lot of flexibility in some classes with no gear will just do absolutely far better than others. But then you reaching the point where, I mean, Scotty J is our rep paladin in the 10-man, and he just got absolutely decked out in the first drops from the first raid night. He's pumping insane damage on the meter, so he's completely skewing my opinion of what rep paladins are capable
Right.
of at the moment.
Oh, did he go full streamer privilege mode on you?
Well, yes and no, but in the comp we're running, I'm the only other strength contester on any of the gear that drops for him. So if it didn't have tank stats on it, I was just passing it. So he got the trinket, he got some shoulders, and he got quite a few other bits and pieces over the last two days of raiding. So he's just absolutely smashing
Right,
it.
so he's laughing, and if we see him bitching about anything over the next week or two, we can tell him to shut the fuck up.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely.
Very good. Um, well, that's a very diplomatic answer of you, mate. I'm very glad that we didn't have to drag any classes or specs. So, I mean, I understand what you're saying. That look,
I'll
Majay.
give you the class if you want me to throw one under the bus
Yeah,
for
fuck
you.
it. Let's
And
do it.
I
Let's go
I,
nuts.
I will set the table here to say my good friend and arena partner, Classic Go, is absolute legend and stalwart in his boomkin approach to the game.
I
But
feel like the mother of all butts is coming. Yeah.
absolutely, it's just I respect this man and what he can pull out of his class is phenomenal. And yes,
Pull out
he's
of his
not got
class or
much
his
gear at the
ass. Yeah.
moment, but I really do think that boomkins are in a very poor state at the moment. But
Right.
again, we could see with more higher gear that could scale up out of proportion. We don't know really at the moment, and people really don't look too fondly at boomkins at the moment. I think you
Hmm.
have a spot in 25 man, but in 10 man, I think it's really good luck because the
Yeah.
failed druid just offers so much more.
No, fair enough, fair enough. Mate, on the content in terms of, the totality of the encounters and just the feels right now, I quit Wrath halfway through Alduar and I enjoyed Wrath raiding. It wasn't necessarily the raiding content that had me walk away, but people shout out continuously how amazing the dungeon and raid content is in Cataclysm. Have you felt that already at this initial stage, or how would you compare it if you were explaining Cata raiding right now in this phase from what you've seen over the last 24 hours to someone who hasn't done it before, but maybe has done Wrath raiding? Would you say it's basically the same thing, or are there already notable design differences from the raid designers back in the day?
Do you want me just to focus on dungeons or raids or both? Because I
Let
think there's a very big difference between both
let's
Wrath
start with the
dungeons and Wrath
raids. I
raids.
think we've talked about the dungeons a little bit. I mean, people we'll talk about the dungeons after this because I do want to talk about some of
Sure.
the Reddit bitching that's going on. Let's focus on the raids first.
In terms of raiding, I think if you did any of Ulduar hard modes, you would be having a reasonable expectation of what the normal fights are now in the Cataclysm tier of raid. There's enough mechanics that everybody has to be aware of not just their role, but how they position, how they interact, and how they can benefit the group by optimizing their role, even just on a normal difficulty. The That being said, the requirement is just once again on normal difficulty. If you've got item level 346 or 345 ish, more than capable of clearing the encounter. We did that all on the beta, but it's really about comprehending the fights, and that's really what raiding's been at a core stage for. I think as soon as we got out of Molten Core and we started putting a little bit more than one mechanic on boss fights.
Mm,
So really, it's a step up from Wrath of the Lich King raiding, but not too much. I think it's just really does test the raid leader's ability to raid lead at this tier. And if you've got a core solid raid leader, I think
mm,
you won't have any issues going into normal raiding
mm.
in
Well,
Cataclysm.
to drag you down that tangent, and obviously we had such a lovely time meeting Majay last week on the podcast, and I just listened back to it driving around town this morning, and he was absolutely. I mean, Scott EJ was fantastic as well, obviously, but Majay was just—he's so well versed in the game and so confident when he talks about it. I had a blast listening to his input. To imagine having him as a raid leader would be such a boon to any raid, but. I mean, to throw you on the spot, and don't get me wrong, talk shit about the guy if you want. We can have a bit of fun tongue in cheek. But what what would you say makes someone like Majay a better raid leader than others that you might have had in the past?
Oh boy. I do need to be diplomatic on this because I know several raid leaders of mine will be listening to this. I've been a former raid leader myself, guild leader, and I've played WoW for since 2008 on and off most of the time. And the last retail I played was BFA. The relevance of that is the role of the raid leader has changed over WoW's history drastically. But to where we are in Cataclysm, I think what you need and what qualities Majay has on that is such a detailed level of knowledge about the fight that he can sit there and explain it beyond what the dungeon journal can tell you
Hmm.
and give you options and give you suggestions of how you can deal with the mechanic, how he wants you to deal with the mechanic. And that is more important than, watching a 30-second, not in any way to take away from the guides that are out there and the content creators, 30-second boss guides. I think they're fantastic. They give you an overview, but they don't give you the detail. They don't give you the instruction. They don't tell you, well, what happens if this goes slightly wrong? How do you
Mm.
recover? How do you save the pull?
Yes.
And that's where the really good raid leaders step in, when stuff isn't going as planned,
Yeah.
but they still get you the fight secured and the loot dropped at the end of the day. That's the mark of a
Mm.
great raid leader, really, I
Mm.
think.
Yeah. So you don't know. Great raid leaders are forged when the shit hits the fan.
Oh, absolutely. My raid leading approach quite simply was under the premise of, if you hear the raid leader speak in the raid for any time that everything's going as expected, something's gone wrong.
Mm.
Basically, the raid leader should only be talking when stuff hasn't gone to plan. That's my raid lead approach, and that works for certain people. But for a lot of other people, they just want to be laughing, having a good time. But when that mic opens, you got to be listening. You got to be paying attention. So
Mm. It's
that's my approach. It's a bit different to Majay's.
It's a funny one. I just on raid leading real quick as a massive tangent. I have been so hesitant. I never wanted to take on any form of leadership or activity in terms of guilds or raiding or anything like that for so long. And through Season of Discovery, just a few months ago, I found myself somewhat randomly thrust into or asked to do a bit of raid leading just for a small 10-man team in things like Gnomragon. And I'd never done it before in my life. And I actually took to it like a duck to water. I really, really enjoyed it. And, my mates who would love nothing more than to tell me I'm terrible and give me shit were actually very complimentary and said, "Hey, Josh, you're actually not bad at that. You should keep going." And I found that it's a lot of fun. But the one thing that I know is a huge limitation of mine, which makes me a pretty shitty raid leader, is like you say, I can read and understand an encounter and explain that to a layman and be like, hey, this is what the script says is going to happen, blah, blah, blah. When this happens, you do that, all that shit. The thing that gets me held back is, despite the disgusting amount of time that I've put into World of Warcraft over the years, I find that all the good raid leaders I've come across, they just know every class inside and out. And even though they don't play them, they know, hey, you use this ability at this time, or you could consider using this ability, and then we'll get the druid to do this because he's got that in his toolkit, or we could get the shaman to do this. And I'm like, yeah, I know these spells exist, but I do tend to forget about them because I'm not playing every class. And these guys they don't only know the raid content like the back of their hand. It's like they made the game when they talk about classes, and they never forget anything. And I just don't have that. And I've always had a great amount of respect for people that just, the people that come on the podcast like you, that I can ask any question about any class and get a very intelligent answer back within a second and a half about, well, this is what I think about that, as though they've played the class their whole life, which they might have. But I've always respected that in a good raid leader. Do you find I just don't come across many raid leaders that put their hands up to do it that don't actually know much about classes they don't play? Do you know what I mean?
I do, but I'll just outline here. I've been part of quite a few guilds in my time over Classic, but I've stuck. Well, I've been in and out of this guild, but I've been in the same group of people since Blackwind Lair in my EU guild,
Mm.
and they're a lovely bunch of guys, and they're an absolute amazing group of people that I'm just going to shout out to: the Scarlet Crusade, Crimson Legion over and now on Firemore, I think we're on.
Mm-hmm.
But the raid leader there, if I can shout him out, the real Connie, he is a man who puts so much effort into just making this happen week in, week out for all these years. I hope he doesn't think too negatively of this, and I think he's genuinely aware of this. He doesn't have the best knowledge of every class, as you're saying, the
Mm.
mark of the best raid leaders do, but he has people skills, and he has the
Yes.
ability to say, hey,
Oh,
look, we've got this problem. What can we solve? What can we
that
do
goes
about it?
without
Do you
saying.
have input?
Yeah, that's the number one quality that you need, and I feel bad not talking about that. But yeah, I almost felt like it goes without saying. But you're right to shout it out, that it's funny that in a game that typically attracts, let's be honest, a larger audience that aren't necessarily world renowned for their social skills, if we're being real.
Myself included in that.
Yeah,
Don't worry.
and I'm not like throwing shade at people for that. There's nothing wrong with not being the most wild sociable person out there. Some people use World of Warcraft as an avenue to get some form of their personality out there to the world when they might not be having the opportunities to do that IRL or whatnot. But it's funny that the game does ask, for a successful raid to go through, to have that one person who has extraordinary people skills. And I'm always really pleased that we get the amount of people that we do see. When, like, don't get me wrong, I've been in those nightmare guilds that have the raid leader with the fucking social skills of a piece of shit. You know what I mean? But I think that we trip upon natural leaders with charisma more often than I would have guessed in the World of Warcraft.
I think absolutely you're spot on, but I would also say that as someone who my raid leading approach has purely stemmed, and my guild leader approach has purely stemmed from the first exposure I had from the first raid leader and guild leader that I revered when I was a teenager. I basically modeled how I approached the game and how I approached communication skills off how they did, and not as militaristically that they were as an ex-army veteran, but they were phenomenal in taking control of a scenario and giving clear, crisp communications. And then the most important thing that I think a lot of people sort of forget is, taking the opportunity and the time at the end of the night just to thank for everyone's attendance and just saying thanks for having a great time. I'll see you
Mm.
next week.
Mm.
Just that little point at the end can just absolutely turn around a 4 or 5 hour white fest into a, yeah, actually, I want to come back and I want to beat that boss with this group of people.
Yeah, absolutely. Mate, from we'll get there eventually with the blood DK. Actually, I might let me think. There was one more thing I wanted to say. Well, I'll just say from the tanking perspective, obviously your viewpoint is skewed a little bit because you are driving the blood DK. I'm not sure. Well, you'll laugh at this because I was about to say,
Sure.
I'm sure that makes things a bit easier for you. But, as we covered on the show, just because blood DKs are overpowered doesn't mean that they're easy to drive. It's just the good players make it look easy. But how's it felt from a tanking perspective, this phase of content that we've got now?
From a tanking perspective, I think right now in your journey through Classic, I don't think the tank has had a more prominent driving seat until this expansion. I think you are now in the most control. And that's really hard to sort of weigh up because people will think, well, look, tanks have always been the leader of the group. They've always been the first person into the fray. And, if they fall, everybody else does. But
Mm.
what I mean is there are so many niches and tricks and ways of executing dungeon clears and strategies where if your tank can just do that one thing better, that could mean you only need to bring one tank, which is a far faster kill because you can get extra DPS in there, or you can play more aggressively or more defensively. The ball is really in your court as the tank player to really benefit the group how much you can by your experience and your ability to play. So a really, really solid tank can maximize, and just really their impact is very noticeable now in Cataclysm,
Mm.
to contrast against where just, oh, I tank occasionally, I have a prop warrior or a paladin or death knight, and or even a fell druid, and you just know the raw ins and outs, and you've tanked a few dungeons and you sort of understand what buttons you need to press. You followed a guide, you've got your best in slot list or your prebis, and you don't really understand the benefits of, well, do I move this mob to here? Do I stun this one? Do I kick that one? Do I charge there, or etc.?
Mm.
And you really can stand out by just getting that exposure, getting that experience, and just getting the feel for the game as a tank in Cataclysm now, far
Mm.
more so than I think you could in the other expansions, just because there's so many more mechanics for you to deal with that the tank in the toolkits now have answers to.
Mate, Last question on tanking, and then we'll move. Sorry, last question before we move on to the blood DK stuff. But having said all that, how did you feel listening in to me bitch to Scotty last week and lamenting about, the loss of the threat mechanic in Cata? And you could argue that it went away in Wrath, but it's truly, gone from Cata. I completely am on board with what you're saying in terms of, don't get me wrong, I don't want to make tanking sound easy or stupid in Cata. A good tank, like you're saying, who presses their mitigation cooldowns at the right time, you can really tell a good tank. They make life a lot easier on the healer. They make life a lot easier on the raid by just knowing fucking what buttons to press and when. It's phenomenal. It is a skill cap that like a lot of players probably can't do. Same thing comes from, like I always keep bringing up, Final Fantasy XIV. The tank cooldowns are huge, and you really notice when you have a tank who's either not pressing them or doesn't know exactly when to press them. Having said all that, when you heard me bitch about, I'm more of a threat tank guy than a mitigation guy, hitting cooldowns doesn't excite me in the same way as wrestling and managing threat does. How do you feel about Cata tanking versus the what we've come from?
I think so. I have a bit of a broader spectrum on this because I tanked on all tank classes in Wrath of the Lich King for pretty much all the tier. Well, okay, that's not fair. From Uldua onwards, I had all 4 tanks actively raiding. Some of the classes, no, that's not fair at all. Prop Paladin, you push 2 buttons and nothing would leave you. Threat wasn't in the game for Prop Paladin in Wrath of the Lich King if you built your character correctly. If you went for pure defensive, you had threat problems on every single DPSer who knew what they were doing. Come the end of ICC, you also had the scenario where I played a Death Knight, you press Icy Touch, threat doesn't exist, right? And you push 2-3 Icy Touches, that mob's yours, you can go AFK. I had several fights where I did this. Blood Queen Lanethel, I would just get my threat lead and then I would say, right, now it's the time for me to go take a break because I need to go get a drink, and I would come back 2 minutes later and still have the boss. Like, that was certain points of the game. So the argument of, has threat been an issue? Well, it's not been an issue for some time in certain aspects. In Cataclysm, threat is now like a toggle situation where in a dungeon, if you are chain pulling and you keep the vengeance up and active, threat no longer exists. But if you let that drop for 1 second, you suddenly feel it on the next pack because all the nameplates just suddenly go red and you've lost control of them, anything that you weren't hitting. That happens very quickly. And I've just come off 40 plus wipes of Valakir where, because of the spec I'm running, I have very little hit and almost no expertise. We had several pulls where our rogue and ret paladin were just getting global because in the first 3 seconds, I get dodge, parry, miss. The boss says, "Oh, thanks very much." Turn around, clap the retribution paladin who's pumping 40k DPS. So threat does exist. It's just in these scenarios at the moment. Do I like that? I'm just sort of going with the flow because we've had threat is the most important thing with the Fury Warrior in classic tanking in vanilla. We've had threat is now sort of a joke if you're a prop paladin in TBC, and then threat's just become this thing that is on or off depending what you play in Wrath. So it's kind of just taking its own little version in Cata. I think it's there in some instances and it's not in others. So it's just, I suppose, what you enjoy really. It adds to the skill cap if we say anything for the safe answer. A good tank knows how to keep the vengeance up, and a bad one just they lost on the RNG of did they keep their hit chance high enough or their expertise high enough. I suppose you could just take that approach.
Fair enough. All right, mate, let's talk about the class that's near and dear to your heart right now. You are maining a Blood DK, and, we talked a little bit about Blood DKs, not only in my Blizzard interview last week, but also in the chat with Scotty and Majay. And, I keep bringing up to people, this overall concept of the behemoth that is Blood DKs and Cata. And, it's funny because I'd heard so much about it in the content leading up to launch. I've still, for some reason, didn't, invest that much thought into it, where I was like, oh, every expansion's got a spec that's very powerful. I'm sure it's just the same as all the others. And I didn't really realize it's not until you see, particularly from a healer's perspective, what a Blood DK can do. And again, I've only done like 5-man dungeons, but you see what they can do in PvE content. And then, it's funny because I have to laugh at myself. And this is why I say I'm the world's greatest fuckwit, because I always do shit like this. I said on the podcast that, Cataclysm for me is not the tanking expansion. I don't like the threat's not a thing anymore. I'm not going to touch a tank with a 10-foot pole in Cataclysm Classic. 48 hours later, I rolled a Blood DK, as you do. And I really enjoyed it. It is just a bonkers spec to play. Like, the damage is insane. And it's a weird one where, like, I kind of just feel like I'm playing a DPS class. I don't really feel like a tank in an odd way. But, mate, if I were to say to you, on the topic of the, as I shudder to say, the OP-ness, of Blood DKs in Cata, you've heard all these conversations. How do you feel about the state of them? And, I'm sure you'd agree that we don't want to nerf anything. If anything, you just talk about dragging the other tanks up to meet the Blood DK at their level. But how would you describe the silly nature of Blood DKs and how powerful they are in Cata?
I'm gonna throw you a highlight clip here, and in a one word, balanced. Mm-hmm. The reason why I say that is because in the Blood Death Knight approach to the game, you have two options. When you're fulfilling the tank role, you can take a subsidiary role, and that can either be the tank DPS or the tank healer. And the problem as to why people perceive that to be overpowered is because if you sort of streamline down the middle to you've just hit 85, you're just getting your gears to go into heroics. Out of the box, the Blood DK does the most base damage because they have the best default position when they hit 85. That's not to say they're overpowered. That's just they're out of the box better. In last week's interview, when you were talking to Scotty and he was saying, I'm topping DPS, I'm topping healing, and I'm putting a God mode, I think was the quote, when I enter the dungeon. That was true for the first week. Literally the day after he did that interview with you, he came into the raid with his, came into some heroics with me to do the 7 reset clear. I was bottom DPS doing half the damage of the other people in the group. Right. So basically the DPSs got their gear and they started doing proper damage.
Right.
So that's where I say, are we OP? No, because DPSs do their job when you find people in the gear and who know what they're doing and are comfortable in the environment that you've got them in. Comparing that to the other three tanks, however, which is where I think you're really going with this, yes, we outshine the other tanks because we do more damage than them, we have more survivability than them, and the only thing that we're outclassed on is cooldowns. We have very good personal cooldowns, but we offer nothing to the group other than a, oh shit button, the healer died, I'll combat res you. That's our utility to the team. So overall, I think we're very balanced at the minute. In a raid position, someone's going to say, yeah, but Riggz, every team's got 1 or 2 DKs on all of these clears, and how can you say that's balanced? Well, because that community that you're looking at are the people who say, what's the best one? It doesn't matter if they're best by 1 or best by 1,000,000 in whatever metric of that your stat you're tracking. They will play the best because it is the best.
Right.
I'm just trying to say the lead is not as big as people are making it out.
Fair enough. It's a blast to play, and I really do encourage anyone who hasn't tried Blood DK and Cata to at least just go out and give it a spin. I really appreciate that one of the design philosophies for Cata across the board, not just in raid content, but in the way that you drive these classes as well, does seem to be more on the emphasis of personal responsibility. And what I mean by that is, like, we're going to get into the weeds here now about what makes a good Blood DK, but I felt this on my Resto Druid as well, where it's like they've just given you all these buttons that they've sort of really thrust it on the player, saying like, hey, this shit isn't passive anymore. Like, we're giving you interactive abilities to distinguish yourself amongst the crowd. And what is a built up population of blood DKs, because everyone wants to be the flavor of the month, you're still going to be able to stand out because, yes, this class can heal itself and can be super, super tanky and super survivable. But it's not just automatic. It's not like a fucking paladin in Wrath with the cheat death mechanic or what have you. You know, it's on you. You have to press the buttons at the right time and know what all these things do. And my God, I have seen the difference between a good and a bad blood DK. I'll tell you a funny story in a second. But, mate, what I'm getting at is, do you appreciate... Have you noticed or have you felt or do you appreciate that design difference between putting survivability behind passive talents versus what the blood DK is in actually pressing buttons?
That's quite interesting because the reason why they're strong is the passive
Well,
mastery,
the mastery, right?
which is a stat that you can increase through your gear with mastery rating to
Right.
increase your physical damage shield absorbed.
Mm.
Now, if you do enough heroics, you will see that there is plenty of magic damage and lots of things in there that your mastery does not protect you against.
Right.
But to offset that, you still heal a raw health based on the damage you took in the last 5 seconds, and that is the other bit. So if you're not topping the meter because you're reducing physical damage going in, you're topping it because you're just healing up back up. So that's why you're really strong, because you offset both magic damage and physical, whereas the paladin and warrior really only offset the physical through a block. So where I would say the strong point on the passive versus the active, I would argue Paladin has more active buttons than Death Knight.
Fair enough.
Because you have so many utility keys that you can put on other players, and it really comes down to playstyle. If you want to be the hero, the protagonist of your 5-man dungeon, you pick that blood DK, you lock it in, you get that instant dungeon queue for the tank, because that's the reason why we play the class, because no one wants a 35-minute wait queue as a DPS. And you go in and you're the star of the show, and everyone's there just to help you get your gear, right? You can take that approach and you can shine, or you could play the other tanks and be poo-pooed because you're not a blood DK, but you can do other things on those tanks that a blood DK can only dream of. And this might surprise you, but the funnest tank I've ever played is Prot Warrior.
Oh, it's easily the most fun.
5-man content.
Yeah.
You offer exactly the opposite to what the blood DK has. It's just at the moment, because of the level of gear, because of the challenge of the Cataclysm step up from Wrath of the Lich King dungeons, the mobility doesn't really do anything at the moment. So even though you're the most mobile as a warrior, great, you can charge in, you can do another charge, you can do a heroic leap, and now you're 60 feet away from the raid. Your party, you stunned everything, and they're only just getting to the fight. It looked really cool to do, and now you're dead. Whereas the Death Knight ran in, brought 2 more packs with him, healed up, and topped the damage meters.
Yeah.
Well, one was more fun to play, the other was just more of a stress ball, because the Death Knight is popping everything to survive that triple pull. And if you've got an elemental shaman there or a fire mage who presses combust, well, they're going to outshine the Death Knight anyway, because they're just going to decimate the DPS meter with chain lightnings and combustion. So,
my God, those Ellie shamans are lighting up the meters. I'm really seeing it. It's bonkers. But anyway, mate, let me ask you. So I'll tell you my little, whether you call it a nightmare story or not. I'm really interested to hear your interpretation of this as a blood DK main. I'm still getting so used to this spec as a healer. Like, I'm watching all my tanks like a hawk and sort of trying to figure out the different play styles, when to worry about them and when they're fine and all that kind of stuff. And to see the good tanks that are popping their cooldowns and the ones that don't really know what they're doing, and I'm having to constantly babysit them. So Voodoo's in chat. He'll know what I'm talking about. We had a blood DK just yesterday that I'd never seen. I've played healer all through the pre-patch. I've done like 150 dungeons on this Resto Druid, getting him up to 85 and all that shit, which has been pumping the content. I've never had a more stressful healing job than I did in this dungeon yesterday. And I want you to tell me what this blood DK was either doing right or more than likely wrong. I've never seen a health bar yo-yo as violently as this guy's health bar was. And he was all within, I shit you not, all within the space of like one global, like 1.5 to 2 seconds time. He was going from 90% health to 10 to 90 to 50. And we're just watching his health bar going, what the fuck is going on? He was getting abused by like small packs, but then doing these huge death strikes or whatever, I presume, to heal himself up, but then getting decimated again. And I hadn't even cast a heal on him yet. And we just watched the yo-yo go up and down going, this is fucking insane. And I'm like, he either knows what he's doing because he's not dying, or he has no idea what he's doing. Because every blood DK I've had, their health like it's very steady, and their health would seldom drop below like 80, 70%. I don't know what it was. But if hearing that story, what would you guess was going on there?
PvP gear.
PvP gear, really?
Yeah. If you've just dinged 85, it is a well-known technique for you to take your gold purse and go to the auction house and buy 339 blues and now be able to queue for heroic dungeons.
Right.
You have a huge amount of strength, you have a huge amount of stamina, a huge amount of crit rating, and a bit of hit and expertise. You have no avoidance.
Right.
Which means every hit will land. And assuming you're not walking around with your back to mobs, you are going to yo-yo like you've just described. That would be my first expectation. The other one would be they might not have had an awful lot of experience, or they were just taking an awful lot of magic damage, and without knowing which dungeon it was, without knowing, you know, what their HP pool was, the size of the pool. Even if you say it was a small pack, this depends which heroic you are. If you wanted to go to the nitty gritty, I could probably talk you through most pools in most heroics, Josh, if you really wanted to.
Oh, no, it's all good. But yeah, it's just like, I've really appreciated the consistency of healing the Death Knight, where, you know, they go into a pool and I'm really sort of like, hey, I can be offensive for the first, you know, good 5, 6, 7 seconds here because they're going to be more than okay. And when you eventually have to heal them, it's not a dire situation. Like, I love healing blood DKs, and like in a weird way, like obviously there's times when you feel like they don't need you, but they're just so survivable. It's really fun to watch.
You're playing as a resto druid for that role, right?
Yeah.
I think the blood DK really synergizes with smite priests, discipline priests, and resto druids, and hybrid resto shamans. But Majay might be skewing my opinion on that one
because
of his caliber.
Yeah.
But in terms of that reasoning, is because those two classes are, well, the smite priest deals damage and then just passively heals AoE, so it's constant trickling in healing, which is exactly what the resto druid specializes in, right? And if the Death Knight is predominantly doing a huge amount of offset with their mastery in terms of the raw damage coming in, and then doing a big chunk of, they're doing the main healing, you're then just keeping them topped up. So that's why it pairs really well. If you want to put something like a Holy Paladin with us, then it gets really confusing, because the Holy Paladin is constantly starting a channel, cancelling it because the DK did the heal. Then he starts the next channel, and then that needs to go through. And then the Death Knight overheals because he didn't know the heal was coming through. And it can get really spiky with the yo-yoing when you start playing with certain classes of healers. Not to say that there's a bad pairing. I think every healer is good for a Blood DK, but it's more a case of if the Blood DK doesn't have the healer on focus and isn't watching the cast bar, you're already making a very big mistake, because you aren't optimizing the healing that you could be doing in the group. And I would certainly say if you know someone's in your very capable hands as a resto druid, Josh, I would certainly be expecting their health to yo-yo a lot, because I would certainly be saying, right, Josh has got me. I'm going to be heart striking. I'm not pressing death strike on this pack.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a funny one. That synergy is so important, and like you say, getting a healer tank sort of trust system going. But you know, I really like it when you get that level of confidence with your tank, where they can see me not casting heals, being offensive for a window of time, and knowing that it's okay, he's got me when shit hits the fan, I can just do whatever I'm going to do. It definitely leads to different play styles, and it makes things a lot of fun. But, mate, an interesting question that I'm dying to know is, it's I don't know whether this gives you the shits or not, but it's such a flavor of the month spec given its power, and so many people want to play it, to the point that even I'm playing it now just for a bit of a laugh. But what do you see the people who don't really know what they're doing with their blood DKs being guilty of, that experienced blood DKs laugh at? What's the ability they're either not pressing enough or they're hitting at the wrong time? What's the fatal mistakes shit blood DKs make?
I would probably say talents.
Oh yeah.
I think you have so many options with your talent builds, and depending on how you personally execute on your playstyle, all of them are justifiable right now. I play a very tailored build for the for the raid progression I'm doing right now, where I'm going into Frost to pick up Lichborn for self healing because on a lot of fights it's needed. When you do heroics with that, you truly can just say, Mr. Resto Druid, I don't want you to do anything other than keep a life bloom on me, because you can wrath to your heart's content. I don't need you for 45 seconds in this fight. Just go and kill the boss quicker, right? But then you can take the far more aggressive build where you go into Unholy, you're getting more disease damage, more disease duration, more death and decay damage, and you can go top those meters. You've lost a little bit of that survivability, and you've lost a lot of the ability to refresh your death strikes through getting death rune refreshes, because you're not taking necessarily all of the points in Frost to get more runic maximum power. So just those 3 talent points there could immediately change your death strikes per pack, because getting 2 or 3 more death strikes, well, that's the difference between the healer going, oh, that's a squeaky bum moment, and, well, the tank didn't need anything. 2 more buttons can make all the difference in that regard. So I would say talents is the biggest one, but if you were going to say to a button press that's the least used, Bone Shield is
Really?
just such a
That's the one I press the
button,
most.
If you're pressing it the most, you're doing it right.
Good.
But when I'm watching some of my fellow guildies, they will go the entire dungeon, they'll put it on at the beginning,
and
then they'll
about it.
realize as they're approaching each boss that they've not pushed it since.
Oh no.
So it's
that 20% damage
it
reduction is ridiculous.
It is, and a lot of people just put it on and forget about it. But it's really the kind of thing where if you're on a boss, it's a huge cooldown against anything that hits hard.
Yeah.
And on trash packs, it's only going to trigger because it has an internal cooldown. It can't trigger on every single attack.
Right.
But it just means, okay, if you're walking in and there's a really large hitting mob, and that's the thing that you're going to get a aggro on first, you're going to immediately offset 20% of the damage on that hit.
Yeah.
But you're still going to get the full value for the damage taken in your mastery calculation, which means you're then going to turn around and smack with a death strike that gives you a huge shield absorption and puts you back to full health. Whereas if you didn't have that bone shield on, you're not quite going to be at full health, and then the next hit comes in, and then the healer starts panicking.
Having said that, I don't know how I feel about the ICD on Bone Shield, because it feels very, very short, because Bone Shield runs out pretty fucking quickly, and I find that, that 60-second cooldown, which doesn't sound like much, there were a lot of moments where I was like, fuck, 30 more seconds until Bone Shield, I'm already out.
I would probably say, now I'm a big proponent to having a custom UI, because I think just the Blizzard default buffs and debuffs system, it's too far out of my peripheral vision. I can't actually see it, so I need cores to bring it into my vision range. But the number of Death Knights I ask, so what weak core are you using to track your Bone Shield? And they say, I don't have one, or just a simple one. And they don't know how many stacks they have left on it. That's a huge faux pas in my book. Just if you don't know how many stacks of Bone Shield you have left, well, that means you're not tracking your big defensive cooldown.
Even at worst, which is what I do, I just do the most basic one, and everyone knows I've got a weird obsession with weak auras, but like, just to have the weak aura that says, hey, your bone shield's gone. It's easy. Just like it would talk about like the most mandatory fucking weak aura of all time if you're playing a blood DK.
Yeah, I use a heads-up display, so I just have a visual bar that's decaying for its duration, and then I have a stat tracker,
Yeah,
so
because
I know how many stacks it has at the moment,
you're a
and when it's
pro.
gone, I can refresh it.
You're a pro. If I took it seriously, I'd set one up that would probably pop up on my screen when I'm down to my last charge, so that I prep it and get ready for it. But yeah, mate, you'd have a fucking pro UI, I can imagine. But it's one of those things with Bone Shield that like I'm shocked to hear that like a lot of people find themselves that you notice people not using it that often because I mean surely you know what I'm talking about when I say like I feel like as opposed to other not major defensive cooldowns, but there are certainly some tanking abilities that like might mitigate some damage, but like I don't necessarily notice it that much. But like I fucking know when I don't have Bone Shield on. Like you see it in your health bar. You know what I mean?
Yeah, very much so. Probably on equal importance then is knowing what to anti-magic shell. And I think this is what the DK sort of skill cap comes down to. Yes, we have a lot of buttons, but they all have very short cool. With the exception of your shield wall, you have very short. Sorry, Icebound Fortitude. You have very short cooldowns, and in you don't need to just push them because they're available. You need to use them because this thing coming in, you can offset a huge amount of healing, which can invite more damage from your group instead of having to wait, get another drink in maybe, and the likes of anti-magic shell on 45-second cooldown, vampiric blood on a minute with your bone shield. It's really just rotating through that constantly, and that's sort of why I really enjoy the blood decay in Cataclysm, because it's not just like it used to be where I reached a point at the end of Rattle Lich King where I used to joke with a few people and say, right, give me a duration into the fight and I'll tell you what my next global cooldown button press is. because you can math it out, you know, so long as you had hit cap and expertise cap, it was a fixed rotation. It did not matter and it never changed.
But now you've got prio, right?
Now it's purely reactionary.
Yeah.
Like if you push the wrong button, it can be punishing. If you push 2 wrong buttons, it's very punishing. If you push 3 wrong buttons, well, now you're useless for 10 seconds.
Yeah,
but that's kind of been Death Knight always.
Welcome
really,
to the enhanced shaman in Wrath feeling.
Oh yeah, so I've been told by magician.
Yeah, exactly. Oh well, that's very interesting. Any other light tips for rookie blood DKs out there? I mean, I can assure you, I realize that like I've been playing the class for 2 seconds, so it's okay for me to be making mistakes, and I am a very average blood DK right now. But like, it's a weird spec in that we talk about like the old joke about face rolling, you know, rolling your face on the keyboard and she'll be right. You know, if you're like a frost mage in vanilla or whatnot, but like. I really feel like I was laughing on stream going, I'm just pressing, I don't even know what buttons I'm pressing. I'm just pressing buttons, but they're all so strong I don't think it fucking matters. It's wild in that regard.
I'm
talking about dungeons, not raids, obviously. Like I'm talking about like if you're being a dickhead leveling via RDF, you can absolutely get away with just hitting anything and you'll probably be okay.
I would actually argue, well, you've obviously just given me your take and that's how you felt. I would probably say then maybe this is the elitism in me, means you've not been pulling enough.
Oh, this is the weird thing. I pull massive, like triple packs. So you gather what I was generally doing is you'd run through your first pack, Heart Strike, Icy Touch your second pack, Death Grip your third pack, and you've got fucking 12 mobs on you and life is great. You throw down your Death and Decay and you go, fucking here we go. The problem for me is once that Death and Decay is down and I've done my first 2 Heart Strikes, now I'm like, fuck, what do I do now? And I just start hitting any button that there is and tab targeting. And it seems to work out for me.
Well, that will work to some degree. You'll have enough runes left on that opener for 1 Death Strike, but then you're going to be what I would probably call in a very hard rune lock position because you can't push anything. But then we have empowering weapon for exactly those moments of I've just done a big crazy thing. I need all my runes again now. So that's why we have that get out of jail free button. I definitely think yes, you can do well. What you just did there is that that wasn't pushing any button. You sort of misselling it there, Josh. You
Well,
didn't
I
push
know
anything
I know how to
broken. You had a
gather them up.
very organized opener.
Yeah, I know how to gather them up, but once they're grouped up, now I don't know what to do.
Fair enough. Well, if there's more than five, you push Blood Boil, and if there's less than five, you push Heart Strike, and if you're gonna die, you push Death Strike. That's
Right.
the
That's
flow
very,
chart of Death
that's
Knight.
it. Very good. Let's talk about Deathstrike a little bit, mate. And I wanted to push you a bit on what separates the good from the bad Death Knights. It is such a unique ability, given that 5 second buffer that you're dealing with there and watching what kind of damage you've taken. But do you find a lot of tanks not really realizing the best moment to hit Deathstrike, or not quite?
So I actually came into Cataclysm with an approach to this where I was going to play Reserve it. I was going to treat it like it was ICC. You don't just want to be pushing your buttons because they're available. You want to be optimizing in a very defensive playstyle because, well, Cataclysm's harder. We've got lower gear. I was part of the dungeon spamming meta for all the way up. I've leveled my third Death Knight now, and I just hit heroics today, 20 minutes after leveling because I went and bought all the PvP gear, but don't tell anyone. And it was a case of what could I do to make that experience better? And it really is just about understanding what you can push the class to, really. And my apologies, I think I've just sort of forgotten your question.
No,
Can
you're
you
right. I was
throw
just
it
saying
back at me
about
again?
the use of Deathstrike between the good and the bad
The Death
Death
Strike.
Knights. Yeah.
So the 5 second rule is very important against anything that hits very hard because you really want to offset that damage taken. But if you're in a 5 minute environment, even if you've got a pack, even in a heroic Cataclysm 5 man, if you have a boss and a pack that you've still got residual from, there's very few bosses that are just going to hit you so hard in a single hit that you go, oh, that's when I want to Death Strike. In my experience, I thought that was going to be really important. Sorry, in my expectation of Cataclysm, I thought that would be very important. Having now done hundreds of heroics in the last week and a half, honestly, the correct answer is just if you have the runes available, just press Death Strike because the shield is more important than the heal. That's
Right.
what I found.
Right. Very good. Mate, I won't keep you too much longer. It is very late where you are, and I know you've probably got a bit more time up your sleeve, but I want to do right by
Yeah.
you and not drag this out. We'll have to do this again because you're an absolute delight to talk to, my friend. I've really enjoyed this, so we'll have to get you. I know you're busy for the next couple of weeks, but we'll have to get you back another time after that. Mate, I just want to talk to you a little bit about, you've touched on heroics, and I alluded at the top of this chat to, the light Reddit drama that we are seeing. We're seeing a lot of posts pop up on the subreddit, either whether you call it talking or bitching about player behavior in dungeons and people's adjusted attitudes towards the different playstyle that Cata has asked of the player base. We're talking about, hey, okay, these heroics are post-nerf, but they're still somewhat asking you to engage with the content. You might need to interrupt. You might need to CC at times. Healers, have your fucking wits about you. Tanks, use your cooldowns at the right time. Don't hold on to them for emergencies. It's that step into retail of a more involved playstyle that is so far removed from what we're used to with the classic franchise, particularly in just like heroic dungeons. My question is, like, having done a shitload of heroics recently, like you've talked about, have you noticed the things that people are whinging about in all these Reddit posts about, my DPS don't kick when they should. I keep finding fuckwits in heroic pugs. Can you guys please pull your socks up and fucking pay attention, blah, blah, blah. And sort of the offshoot of this question is also like, I sort of understand now why, not to say that WoW wasn't toxic through vanilla TBC and Wrath, but I do sort of understand now where the pivot moment came for maybe a little bit of elevated toxicity in WoW that we see maybe during Mythic Pluses and whatnot, with players chewing each other out for not lifting their game in dungeon content, whereas we have been in a sleepwalk mode through vanilla TBC and Wrath. And now we find players, and I'm lightly guilty of this as well. We now find players occasionally chirping up and saying, "Hey, fuckwit, can you fucking do the right thing, please? We've got to like work as a team to get through this. It's not just snooze fest content." So yeah, the question, mate, is just have you noticed this yourself?
I've only done a couple of pugs in the last few days because I've been privileged to have had a guild around me that if I say, "Hi, I'm a tank," I already have invite, 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 invite
Yep,
come
yep,
my way
yep.
quickly. But having done a few pugs, I will say I think casters are the people who default to the "but I'm a caster, I go pew pew."
Right.
And it's expected that the melee are the and you are the person who deals with the kicks and you are the person who throws the stun in.
Hmm.
Whether or not that's right or wrong, I think if you've got it in your kit, well, then it's your responsibility to use it. If you don't use it, if you have a justified reason, that's fine. If
Hmm.
you expected it someone else to do it but didn't communicate that, well, that's just making assumptions.
Hmm.
So communicate. But everyone's in Dungeon Finder. No one says anything until it goes south, and then everyone points fingers why they're not at fault, right? But that's, I think, the internet in a nutshell for the last 15 years, very
Hmm.
easily. I would probably, just to dial it back to what you were saying, that all this has come out before in the classic journey. This was exactly what my experience was of Burning Crusade heroics. You had to go in with crowd control, knowing what you were doing on each pack, in each dungeon nearly, and if you mis-executed on it, you were going to wipe.
Hmm.
We're actually not at that level of severity with Cataclysm because we've got the post nerf. But if you don't kick that mob that's throwing 1 second fireballs into your tank, he's only going to die in 3 seconds' time. So it's your choice if you want to kill it, pack or wipe. So I would just say to the people who don't utilize their kit, there's more than just damage buttons in your spellbook for a reason.
Hmm. It's funny you say that about the casters. I mean, this is just obviously anecdotal, but like, I was doing a dungeon with old friend of the show and friend of mine, Zoran. We were doing a lobby dungeon, but like, I was playing a mage, and I threw a counter spell out on something, and he just went like, "Oh, thank you very much for that counterspell. I saw that and I was like, that's a bit weird. It's my job. You know, I've got the ability, but maybe a lot of mages aren't counterspelling. I don't know. But
If you get a mage who counterspells, decurses, or spell steals, or makes you food without being asked, you add them to friends list and play with them forever. Like that's just a rule of life, right? Because that is the one in a million mages.
very good, very good. But mate, I'll take us out on this note just to dive down the toxic angle that I was sort of digging at in that question earlier. Do you think we'll get controversial, and do you think it's outrageous if I were to suggest to you, is it possible that Cataclysm is the progenitor of an elevated level of toxicity in WoW due to a raised level of difficulty that eventually led to things like, you know, pushing the player base on, let's do Mythic Plus, let's give avenues for the game to be harder for people, blah, blah, blah. Do you think this was the starting point of like a shift in toxicity in the community, or not so much?
Well, calling back to my original experience, it was definitely where my younger self felt the, oh, I can't just go into a dungeon and steamroll this in 15 minutes and be done.
Mm.
Because you committed back to a heroic for like an hour. You know, I was not a good player back in 2010. And just the general expectation was these things take time. We're now blitzing through them in 15 minutes again, or even quicker, depending on which dungeon you get. If you can skip, you know, 2, 3 bosses, and you just end up in that position of evaluating what's, you know, the most time efficient. And I think that's what everything dials back to. So where does the toxicity come down to? I think it's the approach the player base has with the game, really, Josh. It's We're here to get gear and get badges and go home.
Mm.
And if you slow that down, that's bad
Mm.
for everyone's justified reason of, well, I've only got my 3 hours today, or I've only got my 1 hour today, or I can only do this dungeon. Whatever the reason is, it's just the default position everyone seems to sort of have these days. And
Mm.
I think I would just say to those people, yes, that's why we're here. I am guilty of this. I have literally spent dozens of hours well, not dozens of hours, probably about 10 to 16 hours a day since launch in heroics,
There you
with the
go.
exception of raiding in the last week and
Right.
a half. And I really do feel that a lot of people who want to play the game for fun are currently being cast aside because this wave of people who have to get the gear because we're going into raids, step aside, we're jumping the queue. That is a very big divide. So to answer your question, yes, I could see that Cataclysm probably is the progenitor to this, but it's not been unique. It's
Mm.
been in sort of every aspect of the game where that community of hardcore raiders or end game progressive players, they've just always been focused that way. We've had
Mm.
it since the beginning of classic WoW. I
Mm.
remember I was a hunter. I couldn't for the life of me get into a Stratho or Scholomance group because I wasn't a warrior or I
Right.
wasn't a rogue.
Right.
So we've always had this, but I think now this time around, I think it's less punishing. If you want to hop in and do a heroic, I think you're at least knowing that, well, maybe it's 30 minutes at worst case. That's
Mm.
twice as good as it was in 2010
Oh yeah,
from
yeah,
from
yeah.
my experience.
Right. Um, I sort of I find myself coining a new term, mate, where you've said that perhaps by your own admission you're a bit of an elitist, and that's fine. Elitists are out there, people who are very very good at the game. They expect a certain level of play from the people that they play with, and that's totally cool. If you set that out, say that out loud, and say I want this, and I sort of want the same level back of commitment. That's all well and good. I'm finding myself becoming more toxic in Cata because I'm not an elitist. I am what I like to call an averagist, where all I'm asking is be average. Just be average. I don't ask much from people I do dungeon content with. And when people aren't even average, when they're almost going above and beyond to, blatantly not press their buttons, really demonstrate to me that they're tuned out and watching Netflix, healers not healing, tanks doing no damage or not using their cooldowns, no one kicking, all that shit. I do stare at the DPS meters and I'm like, I don't care if you do kind of shitty DPS, but I do care if you do almost no DPS, and that's it. I'm an averagist, and sometimes I find myself shocked that even that is too much to ask of some of the players who just don't fucking give a shit. But like, it's all fun and games.
Well, you say that, but I think you're right on the nail on the head of the people that you play with in these dungeon finders and just the general trade chat that you pick up for groups quickly. Your motivation is the only common denominator. So when you get into a group forcibly made and thrown together by the RDF queue, you don't have that agreed unspoken rule of we're here to go quick or we're here to be safe or
Mm.
hey, I'm new. The communication is not set out, so the table's not set, and then you have yourself. Uh, you're my healer in a group. Let's say I'm chain pulling every mob, and you're experience the DK yo-yo,
Mm.
and you'll start going. I've just had a few beers with the mates. I just want to go and chill out before this podcast,
Yep.
and I just don't want to have to deal with this right now. Can you just slow down?
Mm.
But I say no. I'm in a raid in 15 minutes. I've got to kill this boss to get this chaos orb to craft this BOE for my guildie.
Mm.
Who's right and who's wrong?
Right. Right.
Just no one said anything. So now everybody's wrong. That's the only thing that's really gone wrong in the community, I think. We just
Mm.
stopped talking to each other.
No, it's good food for thought, mate. I appreciate that, mate. Look, we might let you go on that note. You, like I said, you have been absolutely fantastic. I genuinely mean this, mate. It's been an absolute delight meeting you. I think you have been an incredibly insightful guest. It's been a pleasure hearing all of this. We will absolutely have to get you back in the near future. I hope it wasn't too nerve wracking. You did phenomenal.
Oh, I'm still shaking.
No,
I
no,
can't
mate.
deal with this physically now.
You're an absolute natural. Don't worry. Everyone starts out their first podcast appearance like that, and you'll take to it. I mean, you've already taken to it like a fish to water, but trust me, it gets easier and easier. Mate, look, you did a few shout outs before, but any guildies or guilds to shout out? Any people you want to highlight here, or any content you want to throw out there? Please do let people know.
I'll do the shameless, selfless plug. You can find me on Twitch and YouTube at Riggz_gaming. I'm trying to make content for Cataclysm as a Blood DK, basically. So I'm trying to get the ball rolling. It's something I've been interested in a long time, and I've finally decided to try and commit. I have a scuffed microphone set up. I have a PC that can barely run the game. The quality's not in the presentation, it's in hopefully the insight I can offer to people who want to tune in.
There you go,
In terms of
everyone.
just
This,
shout outs, I
yep.
would like to just say a very big thank you to a lot of the people who've been with me on this classic journey for the last few years. If I could just very quickly just say a big shout out to Dragnus, Arkhand, Leon, Snakes. You guys have really helped me through thick and thin, and a very big thank you. And before I go, I do want to just say to all the listeners here, a massive thank you to Josh, because it's people like Josh who have made this community what it is. And honestly, Josh, when I discovered Countdown to Classic in early 2019, I have listened to everything you did. I was working in an accounts department. I converted your podcast into hundreds of sets of accounts, and I made it my ultimate goal that I wanted to play Classic because I found how much you were interested in this game. And your interview with John Stats really set me up to where I am today. So I have a love for this game reignited through what you've done, and I just want to say a very big thank you to you, because I think people like yourself don't have it enough.
Oh, mate, you're an absolute sweetheart. That's very very nice of you to say. Thank you. That means the world to me. Thank you so much to say that. Um, oh no, I'm going to get emotional. Thank you, mate. Look, we should say I always do this. Spelling RIGGZ over there on Twitch. Is that right?
I believe so, yes. Underscore gaming.
Very good. Underscore gaming. Very good. Everyone, please do go and check out Riggz. As you can hear, he's an absolute sweetheart. I need to end this interview before I start crying because you've tugged on my heartstrings, mate. Thank you so much. That's very, very kind of you. Let's get you back on the show another time soon. You and I can coordinate. It's always so hard with the European timing, but we'll work it out. And, mate, get some sleep. And thank you so much once again.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure and an honor. Thanks very much, Josh.
All right, guys, I'll end the stream. Riggz, hang about. I'll chat to you in a second. Stream, thank you so much. I've got to head off. I've got to go play Rust with a friend later on, or he's going to kick my ass for not playing that game with him. But, guys, I'll talk to you later. This podcast will come out on Monday. See you guys. Bye, stream.